Hello everyone and welcome to the shop. For today's video, I'm going to show you how to tile a floor. So for this project, I'm going to be going over how to tile a floor over a wooden substrate. I'll walk you through everything from substrate prep, tile layout, installation best practices, grouting and finishing, and so much more. So let's get started. So if your flooring doesn't already look like this, you're going to want to go ahead and remove any old flooring you have down before getting started, because installing tile requires a clean solid surface to make sure that it lasts. When installing any type of flooring, you will have to consider what to do with your baseboards. You can either leave the baseboard and tile up to them and add a quarter round piece at the end, or remove your baseboard entirely and reinstall after your new flooring has been installed. Once you removed any old flooring, next you will scrape up any easily removable debris left over on the floor from previous projects using either a floor scraper or a flat taping knife. If you demoed an old tile floor and have thin set dried on your subfloor, you will need to use a floor grinder with the diamond cup wheel to remove that dried up thin set. Next, check for any high or low spots and be sure to refer to the manufacturer of the flooring you're installing for their specific flatness requirements. Typically for tiles with one side longer than 24 inches, the floor must not have any deviation over 1/8 of an inch in a 10-foot span. So the next thing to do once your floor is prepped is to consider installing an underlayment, which will protect your tiles from cracking over time. Here, we're going to install an uncoupling membrane because tiling directly to plywood is not typically recommended. I will start by dry laying the underlayment and cutting it to fit into place using a utility knife as I go. Once all my pieces are dry fit, I will remove them and set them aside. Next, I will vacuum the floor and give it a quick wipe down to pick up any fine dust to accept thin set mortar. Next, I will mix up my thin set and begin to apply it to the floor using a 1/16 V-notch trowel. I will start by burning the thin set into the substrate using the flat side of the trowel. I will add more thin set, combing the thin set towards the shorter side of the underlayment. Lay down each piece of underlayment, being sure to collapse the air using a floor roller. It's okay to step on each installed piece as you want to make sure any air is escaped and all the ridges are collapsed underneath. Continue this process for each row until the entire floor is covered. Always be sure to follow the instructions of the underlayment and thin set manufacturer you are using, as some specific steps may differ. So before getting started on setting any tile, the next step is to figure out the layout for the best fit possible for your room. To figure out your layout, you will first choose the wall you want to run the tiles lengthwise, then take the measurement of the room width and divide that by the measurement of the tile plus the spacer. If you are left with a small sliver at the end of your installation, I would recommend you trim the first row that amount so you don't end up with a small sliver at the end of your installation. So since our room measures at 90.5 inches wide and our tiles are 11 and 11/16 wide with a spacer, we're going to divide the room size by the tile size with a spacer to get the number of tiles running the width of the room. So that means in our case, that gives us 7 full rows of tiles and 3/4 of a tile at the end of our installation. So to figure out how much 3/4 of a tile is, we're going to multiply 3/4 of a tile by the width of a tile without a spacer, which is 11 and 9/16 in our case. So that will leave us with 8 and 11/16 of a cut at the end of our install. We're going to stick with this layout. Your room size and tile size may vary, so if you end up with less than half of a tile cut at the end of your install, you can adjust for this by making your first row shorter to make your last row wider. Do this same method for the length of the room, making any adjustments as you go. So with our tile layout figured, I can now continue on the tile installation. Since I'm starting with a full row of tile at the wall, I'm going to place 1/8 spacers along the wall to ensure I'm leaving room for expansion. Once I set the spacers, I can now mix up our modified thin set mortar to the proper ratio as specified by the manufacturer. To keep our first row of tile straight, we'll mark the floor with a marker and a straight edge to create a control line that we will use to install our first row of tile to ensure that the rest of the tile installation remains straight. So since my tile is on the larger side, it's a 12 by 24 tile, I'm going to go ahead and install it using a 1/4 by 3/8 square notch trowel. You can use the rule here that the larger the tile, the bigger your notch trowel. You can always check for coverage by pulling up your tile and size up to the next size notch trowel if needed. So to get started tiling, I will first add my thin set mortar to the uncoupling membrane and use the flat side of the trowel to burn in the thin set to the substrate. Next, I will add more thin set mortar to the uncoupling membrane and spread it using the notch side of the trowel. I'll always spread the notches in the same direction as the shortest side of the tile. This is called directional troweling. Next, I will burn in the thin set to the back of the tile before placing the tile into the thin set mortar. This is called back buttering. I can now place my tile into the thinset. I will firmly press down the tile, moving it perpendicular to my trowel marks to collapse the ridges of the thinset. This method, in combination with directional troweling, allows the air to escape the shortest side of the tile and provides the best thinset coverage possible. Before moving further on into your installation, it is important to check your tile periodically for thinset coverage as you go. You can do this by removing the tile that was set and checking the back for thinset coverage. Ideally, in a dry area, you'll want to see at least 80% coverage. If your tile is not getting the proper amount of coverage, you can switch to a bigger size notch trowel to achieve proper thinset coverage. I will install our second tile adjacent to our first in the same fashion. This time, once the ridges are collapsed, I'm going to check to ensure there is no tile lippage by running my hand over the tiles at the joint to make sure they are flush to one another. I can also use a level or a straight edge to lay across the tiles to make sure they are flat. Next, I can install my spacers and move the second tile tight to the spacers to make sure we have the proper grout joint. So once you've set a couple of tiles, you're going to go back and just clean up the surface of the tile using a sponge. Clean out your joints with a toothbrush or a grout brush before placing your spacers, and clean up any thinset that's left around each tile as you go. It just makes cleaning up later on in the process when you're getting ready to grout a lot faster and a lot easier. As a spacer option, you can choose to use a lippage tuning system instead of regular spacers like we're using for this project, especially for larger tiles like I'm installing here. These systems help reduce lippage while installing your tile, making the installation process faster and more efficient. The use of this type of tuning system is not a replacement, however, for having flat floors prior to installation. To avoid having poor thinset coverage behind your tile and voids underneath your tile, you must use these in conjunction with a properly prepped substrate. You can follow these steps for the remainder of your project, which are the best practices for proper tile installation. So sometimes tile projects may take several days to complete. So what you want to do is wait overnight for your tiled section to dry a little bit, come back and remove your spacers, and then give that section a quick clean before moving on to the rest of your project. Doing this ensures that the thinset in the grout joints, if you have any big caked up thinset or chunks of thinset on the surface of your tile, hasn't really hardened so much that you're going to have to do a lot of work to get it out. The longer you wait and the longer you let that thinset dry, the more it cures, making it harder to get off your tile later on, and that makes your tile more susceptible to chipping. So I like to do this in sections as I go if my project takes multiple days. So at some point in your tile installation, you're going to run into an area where you're going to need to make a cut. I'm making most of my cuts on a tile saw. However, you have multiple options depending on the material of tile you're installing and the size of your tile. If you want to learn more on how to cut tile, check out the video linked below. Once your tile installation is complete and dry, the next step is to grout. But before we can get to grouting, we're going to have to remove all of our spacers and give our tile one final clean before getting started. First, inspect your grout joints to make sure you have no leftover thinset that may protrude from your joints and hinder the grout from adhering there. If so, scrape out the thinset using a utility knife. Scrape off any thinset that may be left behind also on the surface of your tile using a plastic putty knife. Next, vacuum the area to get any dirt, dust, and thinset up from the floor. Finally, get a clean bucket of water and clean sponge to wipe down your tile surface. It's best to do this in sections as to not step on a clean area with your dirty shoes. You may also remove your shoes for this process if that helps. Alright, so now that the floor is clean and ready to accept grout, we're going to move on to the grouting process. For this project, we're using a bag mix grout, which comes in a powder form that you mix with water. Just double check with the instructions on the back of the bag for the grout you are using to get the proper mixing ratio of powder and water for the right consistency. Use your margin trowel to add the grout to your float and apply to the floors. Use the short side of the grout float at a shallow angle to pack the grout firmly into the joints. You can go back and use the long side of the float to really fill up the joints. Also, using the long side of the grout float at a steep angle, you can then wipe away any excess grout off the surface of your tile. Once you've completed grouting, you will need to let the grout dry for the specified time allotted by the grout of your choice. You can check if the grout is dry by touching with your finger. Once the grout is dry, use a clean damp sponge in circular motions to clean the surface of your tile, flipping your sponge and rinsing in clean water periodically. So once you're all done installing your grout and everything's dry, you may notice a hazy film that's dried over the surface of your tile. I'm going to show you how to clean that off right now. Just grab another clean bucket of water and a clean sponge, wiping again in circular motions, working in sections. Only this time, you'll follow up with a clean, dry microfiber rag. For stubborn grout haze, you can follow up with a grout haze remover. Now that your tile installation is complete, you can now reinstall your baseboard trim by either adding a 1/4 round piece to your existing baseboard if you tiled up to the baseboard, or just reinstall your baseboard on top of the flooring itself if you chose to remove it. All right, everyone, so there you have it. For this video, we went over all of the steps for tiling a floor. I hope this video helps you on your next tiling projects. Stay tuned for more videos, and we'll see you on the next one.